get started.
Assalamu'alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. We are from Group 1, Basic Analysis of Drama. We are going to explain the material in Chapter 1 and Chapter 2 about drama and the dramatic and drama and the theater. Before we start the presentations, I would like to introduce our group members. I'm the Aulia, Azizah, and other members are Farihatul Alawiyah, Salsabila, and Vina Sarifah. So without any further ado, let's start the presentation. Next slide, please. Drama and the dramatic, critical summary of existing theories. The continuing influence of normative and deductive theories of drama. Aristotle's theory of drama, although he derived his theoretical categories epagogically from the text corpus of Greek tragedies, and although it was not his intention to establish a norm, his descriptions of drama as the imitations of an action in speech involving close structures of time and space and particular sets of characters, not to mention his concept of catharsis and hamartia, have since the Renaissance at least been considered as the norm for dramatic text. The same is true of the dramatic theories of the 19th and early 20th century, which based on the classical tragedy, European Renaissance drama, and the place of German and French classicism, identified conflict as the essence of the dramatic. Others use Hegel subject-object dialectic as a point of departure to define a drama as a synthesis of epic objectivity and lyric subjectivity, and allocated to it the temporal dimensions of future, or the distinctive quality of suspense. This deductive and historically one-sided way of thinking in triadic generic system continues to exert considerable influence on academic teaching and research. The epigonic and normative poetic theories of drama that have resulted from this have been undermined by a number of influential dramaturgical experiments in the course of the 20th century, and by the increased interest in historically varied and even non-European theatrical traditions, to such an extent that they can only be taken seriously if one chooses to ignore these phenomena. Next slide, please. Okay, the structuralist deficit. Slide sebelumnya. Yeah. The structuralist deficit. The continuing influence of this normative and deductive tradition on contemporary research is all the more detrimental in that it has only recently been compensated for by a few initial attempts to put forward a descriptive structuralist theory of dramatic text, such as those that have already been applied to narrative and lyric text. The reason for this are both scholastic and methodological. First, the multimedial unity of the dramatic text was disrupted by the institutionalized separation of research into literary and theater studies. The consequence of this was a strong bias towards either the printed page or its presentations on stage. Secondly, important new developments in literary analysis, such as Russian formalism and new criticism, with their preoccupations with language theory, have neglected a genre whose expressive qualities are not exclusively verbal, namely drama. The dramatic speech, situations, and dialogue. Narrative versus dramatic speech. Of the qualities that enable us to distinguish narrative from dramatic text, one of the historically most consistent may be defined on the level of the speech situations as the communicative relationship between author and receiver. The beginning of a text typology of this kind may be found in the third book of Plato's Republic, which draws distinctions between report and representations according to whether the poet is speaking himself or whether it is the character who are allowed to speak. Thus, dramatic text may be distinguished from epic or narrative texts in that they are consistently restricted to the representative mode, the poet never allowing himself to speak directly. Of course, in the light of recent narrative theory, one might object that even in narrative text is not the author himself who is speaking, but a fictional narrator created by him. Nonetheless, this objection does not detract from the fundamental importance of this categorical distinction. For whilst the receiver of a dramatic text feels directly confronted with the characters represented in narrative, in narrative text they are mediated by a more or less constructed narrative figure. Next slide, please. A communication model of narrative and dramatic text. First, narrative text. This model classifies the sender and receiver positions according to the various superimposed semiotic level. S4 stands for the actual author in his socio-literary role as the producer of the work. S3 for the ideal author implied in the text as the subject of the whole work. S2 for the fictional narrator whose role in the work is formulated as the narrative medium. R1 for the fictional character communicating with each other through dialogue. R2 for the fictional addressee of S2. R3 for the implied ideal receiver of the whole work, and R4 for the actual reader, that is not only the reader envisaged by the author, but also other later ones. The dark colored area represents the internal communication system of the text. The light color area, the mediating communication system, and the superimposed level LT and L4, the external communication system, first in idealized form, then in its real form, depending on the particular narrative situation. Author narrative requires that positions S2 and R2 be occupied by fully independent characters. I narrative requires that S2 should be occupied by one of the characters that functions on L1, and personal narrative that position S2 and R2 should fade out into a transparent disembodied medium of narrations. In this respect, there is a certain similarity between personal narrative and the dramatic communication model. Dramatic text. The difference between the two models may be seen in the fact that in dramatic text, position S2 and R2 are left vacant, thereby eliminating the mediating communication system. This loss of communicative potential in comparison to narrative text is compensated for in two ways. However, the first dramatic texts have access to non-verbal codes and channels which are able in part to take on the communicative functions of S2 and R2. And the secondly aspect of the narrative functions may be transferred to the internal communication system, for example, by means of the type of questions and answer from SR1, designed to inform the audience more than the protagonist do themselves. Next slide, please. The absolute nature of dramatic text. The absence of a mediating communication system, resulting in the unmediated overlapping of the internal and external communication system, is what conditions the absolute nature of the dramatic text with regard to both an author and audience, and it has been manifested on stage most accurately in the realist conventions of the so-called fourth wall. The absolute autonomy of drama that Sonji talks about does, of course, not really exist. It is fictional and may therefore be broken at various times by an aside, a monologue, and spectators, or by commentary from the chorus. For example, causing alienations and the awareness of its fictionality. Here too, it is the destructions of the communication model by this kind of appearance, short circuit of levels L1 and L3 or 4, which underlines the model's significance. Next slide, please. The time-space structures of narrative and dramatic text. In the absence of mediating fictional narrator as to from dramatic text, the time-space continuum associated with it, the one which in narrative text spans the time-space continuum of the world presented in the narrative does not apply. In narrative text, the variability of these two system of reference allows all sorts of arbitrary rearrangements of time-space relationship to be made, especially in the chronology of the narrative. Topographical juxtapositions, the stretching and shrinking of narrative time, and the extensions of or restrictions of locale. Dramatic text, on the other hand, lack the fictional narrator as an overriding point of orientation. It is therefore the time-space continuum of the plot alone that determines the progress of the text within the individual scenic unit. Next slide, please. Dialogue in the dramatic and narrative text. Whilst the narrator discourse and that of the fictional characters plotted by narrator overlap in narrative text, the verbal utterance produced in the course of the multimedial enactment of a dramatic text are reduced to the mono or dialogical speech of the dramatic figures. Since dramatic dialogue is spoken actions, each individual dramatic utterance does not just consist in its prepositional expressive content alone, but also in the way it is itself the execution of an act, whether in the form of promise or a threat or an act or persuasion. As a speech act, the dramatic speech constitutes its own particular speech situation. This is in contrast to dialogue in narrative text, in which the fictional speech in situations can be constituted by the narrator's report, and unlike philosophical dialogue, for example, dramatic speech is bound to that particular situations. Next slide, please. Drama as multimedial form of presentations. The dramatic text as essentially enchanted text. Enacted text. The omissions of the mediating communication system and formative speech are indispensable to it in themselves. Still rather inadequate preconditions for a model of dramatic communication. Taken on their own, these criteria would force us to identify as dramatic text such historical forms. There is, however, One criterion which enables us to distinguish between such literary forms and drama, the multimedial nature of dramatic text presentations. As a performed text, drama, in contrast to purely literary text, makes us not only of verbal but also of acoustic and visual codes. It is a synesthetic text. This important criterion provides the starting point for any semiotic analysis of drama. Next slide, please. The repertoire of codes and channels. The dominant acoustic sign system is usually language, but this may be accompanied or replaced by nonverbal acoustic codes such as realistic noises, conventional sound effects, bells, thunder, etc., and music. Similarly, the visual component of the supersign dramatic text presents itself as a structured complex of individual visual codes. Repertoire of codes and channels. In the form of a diagram, the repertoire of the codes and channels that are employed in dramatic text. First, classification criterion has been derived from the structure of human sensual perceptions, that is, from the five senses as channels for conveying information, as we remark above. The vast majority of dramatic text has exhibited a clear preference for the visual and acoustic channels, while the remaining senses of smell, touch, and taste have been activated extremely sporadically and then almost exclusively in the modern theater of avant-garde. The second classification criteria is the type of code used. Of particular semiotic relevance in this context is the distinctions between verbal and non-verbal codes and the further subdivisions of the verbal codes into linguistic and paralinguistic codes. Generally speaking, the linguistic code is a symbolic code whose signs are based on an arbitrary set of conventions, which this means that the relationship between the sign and the signified object is unmotivated. At the same time, however, the majority of signs belonging to the paralinguistic and non-verbal codes are either indices that are related to the signified object physically or contiguously, or icons which represent the signified object by being similar to it. Oke, lanjut. Just within the supersigns of the dramatic text, codes of varying degrees of standardization operate together. While the linguistic code represents a strictly standardized system of rules that guarantees a relatively high level of explicitness in the decoding process. The non-verbal indices and icons are much more ambiguous. As a result, this frequently leads to marked differences of interpretation. In the external communication system, however, these horizontal juxtapositions of the various code types is transformed into a vertically arranged hierarchy. The text appears as an iconic supersign within which even the transmissions of symbolic and indexical signs has been iconicized into a fictional model of real communication. This iconic supersign is itself determined by comprehensive secondary codes, the numerous literary and dramatic conventions and genres, and is transmitted by the distributive channels open to dramatic text. It has not been possible to show this process directly on our diagram simply because it takes place on a more comprehensive plan. That's all from me. Thank you for your attention. The next material will be delivered by Vina Sarifah.
Thank you, Dea. The next material about drama and the dramatic. Determined by comprehensive secondary codes, that is, the numerous literary and dramatic convention and genre, and is transmitted by the distributive channel upon the dramatic text. It has not been possible to show this process directly on our diagram, simply because it takes place on a more comprehensive plan. And the third classification criterion differs from the fictional center of information, but rather simply we distinguish between character and non-character. That is the stage, whose costume is related to character as the properties are to the stage, for example. And our finally classification criterion refers to the characteristics that apply to the various ways of transmitting information. In this context, we distinguish between durative and non-durative elements according to whether the same single piece of information is being transmitted over an extended period of time or whether new pieces of information are continually being transmitted. And listing these criteria has underlined and clarified our thesis that the multimedial dramatic text contain more information than the literary text. Not even the purely verbal component of the supersized dramatic text can be determined from the orthographically fine text alone. Since there are a number of unpredictable paralinguistic variables of both and durative, such as a voice quality of the particular actor and, and non-durative kinds, such as intonation, tempo, and the use of pauses, which are introduced into the oral instrument of the text by the actor. And the next, the collective nature of production and reception. Our analysis of the components that make up the dramatic text as a supersite point toward as further quality specific to dramatic text. Indeed, one that derives from its very multimedially the collective nature of production, the extreme division of labor that operates in the modern theater, which distinguishes quite clearly between the various functions of production, such as author, producer, theater administrator, actor, costume, and designer, set designer, and lighting engineer, should not be understood as the historical norm. And in the norm course of event, this collective nature of production corresponds to a collective form of perception in the audience, which at the first time is again the exception as far as purely literary texts are concerned. And the next is drama in the context of public performance activities. Structurally speaking, the features associated with dramatic text that we analyze in the preceding section, the overlapping of internal and external communication system relative autonomy, multimediality, and the collective nature of production and reception are all qualities that also apply to non-literally performed activities. Indeed, a performance can be described as the doing of an activity by an individual or group, largely for the pleasure of another individual or group. Then drama clearly belong to this category as much as game with fixed lure, sporting competition, ritual, and unstructured form of play. What all of these share is the indirect nature of their relationship with the real world. And these structurally related perform activities are partly connected to each other as progressive step in the context of general process of development. And next is drama and the theater. The literary historian is not always quite sharply aware of the importance of nonverbal codes for the dramatic text and the dramatist. Poring over his print text, the former tend to neglect the multimedia aspect of theatrical perform, whereas the latter regard this as a crucial component of the literary text. A play read affects the mind like a play acted can only be true of the reader who is able to bring the numerous explicit and implicit sign and signal inherent in the literary text to life in his imagination. And primary and secondary text. To print the generally distinguish more or less clearly between two layers of text. This distinction is often expressed typographically. One layer comprises the spoken dialogue that takes place between the dramatic figures, while the other refers to the verbal text segment that are not reproduced on stage in spoken form. In both historical and typological terms, then the qualitative and quantitative relationship between primary and secondary texts have been extremely variable. Inscription, dedication, and preface were absent from the majority of printed dramatic texts of the Shakespearean period. Such science drama had not yet been accorded the social status of serious literature. It was only to works of serious literature that were deemed worthy enough to include such editorial paraphernalia. And next, stage direction in the secondary text. From a functional point of view, the first step in classifying the stage direction in secondary text is to analyze to what extent the refer in the stage enactment, that is, to examine the extent to which they can be translated into paralinguistic and nonverbal codes, or if a purely literary reception of is expanded their literature value. Thus, the theatrical stage direction refer to either the actor or the visual and acoustic context within which he performed, and thus that refer to the actor can be divided into the different kinds of instruction governing the manner and timing of interactions and exist steps and physiognomy, costume, gesture, and mimic, the paralinguistic element of speech, and finally the grouping and interaction of the character. The contextual states direction, on the other hand, give instruction governing the set, the properties, lighting, music, and sound. And special effects such as artificial bulk or the use of stage, machinery, and finally change of skin or art including transformation on open stage. And of course, the system subdividing stage direction, those that refer to the actor and those that refer to contact called never pretend to be complete. It may be expanded at any time by application of technological innovation such as film project. And next is implicit stage direction in the primary text. Stage direction are not restricted to the secondary text. However, they may also be found implicitly in the primary text. The more powerful the dramatic dialogue, the more it will convey of the suspense, tension, and atmosphere, and the less it will entrust to the stage direction. Thus, it is possible to construct a large part of the stage action in classical drama or in the play of the Shakespeare period from the speeches of the dramatic figures, insofar as the speech implies an action carried by either the speaker himself or one of the other figures. And of course, implicit stage direction in the primary text may also refer to the visual and acoustic contents. Next is variability in the relationship between the indexed the text and the literary text substrate. The variability of the quantitative and qualitative relationship between primary and secondary text result is a variable relationship between the literary text substrate and the enacted text. That is, in this stage enactment, the literary text may either allow the production to choose from a large number of science interpretation, or it may strictly determine the way the event on stage are performed. And the exact relationship between the literary text and enactment is not only determined by the structure of the text, but also by the degree to which theatrical practice has been conventionalized. As a rule, dramatic texts that are produced at a time when performed and being determined by their particular literary subgroup to a far greater extent that those conceived within a more experimental form, form of theatrical practice. And the interrelationship of the site system. The relationship linking the various site system or code that constitute a dramatic text are no less variable than the relationship outlined in the two previous sections. Thus, in certain historical periods, the visual means of presentation that we take for granted, such as lighting or set, are almost completely absent, with the result that the verbal element gains in importance quantitatively at least. And the complete absence of nonverbal codes imply intended for reading aloud. And it has been in the modernist as about all that the leading theoretician and practitioner of drama such as Aldous Evian and etc. Uh, have planned for a process resulting in the domination of nonverbal codes. And the examples here about show quite clearly that a purely quantitative description of this relationship is not sufficient and must be complemented by one of a qualitative or functional kind. The fundamental question that must be asked at this point is whether the verbal and nonverbal codes are transmitted simultaneously whether or predicts the other. And however, even on the occasion that verbal and non-verbal codes are transmitted simultaneously, varying degrees of independence may be found. Ideally speaking, it is possible to distinguish between analytical and syntactic relationships. And that's all from me. Thank you for your great attention. And the next material will be delivered by Salsabila. Time is yours. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Vina. And next is dramatic text and theater. Dramatic text and theater design. Dramatic text are conditioned structurally by the spatial dimension and technical sophistication of the stage they are performed. Dramatic text is confined with a particular type of stage in mind, and this becomes clear when the text is performed on a stage whose dimension and technical sophistication are different. Texts that were intended for a relatively neutral stage area with little decor have been subject to the condition of illusionist theater, in which the verbally evoked locales are actually required solely by means of illusion, and the original flexibility in the distance between the actor and the audience is destroyed. And the relationship between stage and auditorium. This is not the place for the detailed historical analysis of the technical aspect of the theater architecture or stage design, unless by isolating a number of strongly symmetrized models, we should like to sketch the historical variation and development in the spatial relationship between stage and auditorium. And here sketch the historical variation and development in the spatial relationship between stage and auditorium. Next. First is classical Greek. This kind of stage did not permit a realized style of acting, and a view of the distance between the spectator and the actor subtitles of mind or gesture or a more realized performed conversational tone would have been simply imperceptible. And the second is medieval. This performance also took place on religious holidays and also in the open air, but this time in the form of pageant or unprimitive static platform stage, which were surrounded by the street audience on all sides. Next, and the third is Shakespearean. The audience surrounded the stage on three sides. Close contact between the actor and spectators remain on influential feature. This proximity demanded sophisticated form of verbal, mimetic, and gestural impersonation from the actor. At the same time, it means they were unable to ignore the presence of the audience in the same way that they can do on the modern picture stage. By employing epic techniques such as ascetics or monologues and spectators, the actors repeatedly establish direct contact with the audience, thus undermining the dramatic illusion. And the last is next. Okay. The fourth is court theater. The English Restoration Theatre, which we have selected as an example of the European court theatre of the 7th and 8th countries, was designed to cater for a considerably smaller audience than its Elizabethan predecessor. The Restoration theatres generally stayed no more than 500. And the last is modern pada 19th-20th century atau abad 19 seabad ke-9. The proscenium arch stage represent a decisive step toward the complete separation of audience and stage, and toward the notion of the absolute autonomy of dramatic fiction. The illumination stage is separate from the darkened auditorium by the proscenium arch and the footlight, thus creating the illusion of an enclosed image. Set, costume, properties, the manner of acting, and use of language are conceived as a faithful imitation of society, and this illusion is preserved during scene change by the use of the proscenium curtain. The audience looks into a room, one of whose walls is missing apparently without the actor within that room being aware of this. Next. The stage area and fictional locale. Priority was given to the spatial aspect of the relationship between the audience and the stage. There is, however, a second aspect that is equally important, namely the relationship between the spatial stage area and various fictional locales. Next. The next. Okay. Actor and fictional figure is an analogous scale of relationship may also be observed in those existing between the actor as an actual human being and the fictional figure he represents. And drama and film. Some observation is the result of this is that the audience in the theater perceives the action from a constant distant perspective, whereas in a film, this perspective may be subject to considerably variation as a result of alternation in the camera position and focus. By employing the montage technique, a sentence that has been conceived as a time-space continuum and which in the theater must be performed as such may be divided up into the individual elements of differing spatial perspective and temporal discontinuity. Similarly, a time-space continuum may be interrupted by the insertion of settings taken from different temporal and spatial perspectives. Next. Theater as a social institution. Theater institution, or more broadly art institution, have always been the frontline workers in the area of managing social crisis or revolution. As a first respondent, metaphorically speaking, theater provides space and venue for magnified representation of what society faces as a challenge or risk. theoretical stage, therefore possess the human vulnerability as well as technical equipment to deal with social emotion, to make sense of the chaotic cause, chaotic logic of public life. Sorry. Next. Okay. The public character of dramatic communication as a form of public communication. Literature may be regarded essentially as a social institution sign like all form of communication. It is perceived process, a system of generally accepted norm and conversation, and in addition requires a complex organizational base for its production, distribution, and reception. And the collective nature of their reception makes the dependent of the theater and dramatic text on particular social group much more abused than is the case for the kind of text. Next. Okay. Here a model for the external communication system of dramatic text. AS stands for the encoding code of the sender, and GR for the decoding code of the receiver, and CS stands for the content as encoded by the sender, and CR for the content decoded by the receiver. This model reflects the external relationship of a dramatic text and so may serve as a method for identifying its socioliterary implication. Okay, that's all for me. Thank you for attention. The next material will be delivered by Fariha.
Okay, I will continue the presentation. There is the sociology of authorship. Okay, the sociology of authorship is concerned with the relationship between the dramatic text and the empirical author in his role as a producer of dramas. Okay, first one is not our intention to propose some sort of biographical analysis which attempts to explain a work in terms of the genetic and psychological makeup of a particular author. Okay, the second one is biographical aspect is an important mediator between literature and society. For even if one does not espouse a radically materialist worldview in which the individual appears to be conditioned completely by the effects of his environment, there is little doubt that these thoughts and actions are shaped by the social norms he has internalized in the course of his development. Okay, that is argued by Lucien Goldman, present that playwrights' relationship towards the various Jansenist movements and also to Jansenism as a whole in the overall context of the economic, political, and social antagonism that characterized the social classes of the 17th century. In his view, the subject of cultural creation is ultimately the social group to which the author belongs, with the author himself as the creative individual. However, it is possible to show the extent which the structure of a drama text depends on the social backgrounds of the author, his education, and the social scope of the reference. By producing literary text, and this particularly true of the dramatist, the author is making a public statement. His role as producer of literature is not the result of a freely taken decision or the manifestation of an autonomous identity, but is oriented toward the given social norms for the public for this public role. Okay, next slide, please. As far as dramatic texts are concerned, the sociology of authorship becomes even more complicated in view of the multiplicity of productive functions. Okay, second one, authorial stereotypes are historically extremely variable. The modern theater organization, with its extreme division of labor, is a relatively recent phenomenon. Okay, second one, these authorial stereotypes contain various implications. As alternative approaches to the organization of theatrical production, they all coexist in the contemporary theater and are therefore not merely of historical interest. They condition the structure of the multimedia text and are conditioned in turn by the economic structure of the theater involved. The productive within the theater itself have also been subjected to historical change, and this has been reflected structurally in the form of the text performed. Other influential factors are whether the same play is performed on successive evening or whether it is part of a repertoire and is thus seen in the context of an overall seasonal program. Okay, next slide. The sociology of mediating channels. This is concerned with the conditioning features of the mediating channels and their influence on the structure of the dramatic text. They consist of a complex collection of individual, interdependent aspects. In general terms, this may be identified as the first one is technological aspect. Technological aspect, which covers the technological means available for the stage enactment of the multimedia dramatic text. Okay, second one, economic aspect. The economic aspect covering the production cost and the financing. Okay, third one is the legal and political aspect, which includes the extent of the state control either by censorship or advancement. And then organizational aspect, which examines the relationship between the function of production and mediation. And the last is the socio-political aspect, which covers the institutionalist channels of mediation, such as public education and critical journalism. But in this section, we shall restrict ourselves to the economic and political aspect. The productive, okay, the theater has been repeatedly been regarded as a political matter historically. Then theaters have repeatedly been obligated to rely on various kinds of private or public patronage. Viewed by the authorities with considerable suspicion, it has been controlled either by the imposition of a set religious, moral, or political restriction by the author consortium authorities or by the granting of financial subsidies. Of course, one might also argue that the cost involved in building and maintaining the theater is usually so high and that a purely commercial and self-financing theater can only develop sociologically. Purely commercial theaters are still to be found in the industrial centers and conurbations, even in Great Britain, the traditional homeland of the private commercial theater and a network of council or state-subsidized theaters has grown up since the Second World War. Okay, here too, there have been far-reaching historical and structural change, something that becomes clear when a comparison is made. Okay, next. Okay, the sociology of reception. Sociology of reception analyzes the relationship between the dramatic text and its audience or readers. Okay, the audience that is a primary relevance. Because it is the direct addresses of the text. And the second is the author must take the audience predilections and intellectual background into consideration in the production of his text. If he is at all concerned to achieve either a successful form of aesthetic communication or financial reward or both. The opposite extreme occurs when the intended audience corresponds exactly to society as a whole, that is, when the audience forms a representative cross-section of that society. This causal connection between the social structure of the intended audience and the dramatic text written for it becomes even clearer when the situation in the Elizabethan theater is compared to the Restoration theater of the late 17th century. The classes and audience has come to approaching this ideal was in Elizabethan popular theater, in which all social classes of the urban population were represented, from the apprentices to the nobility, albeit with the expectation of the strictly Puritan section of the middle classes. Okay. Next slide, please. Dermat presumably had the tragedies of French and German classicism in mind here, whose social premises consisted in the belief in an individual that is autonomous in his or her actions and rational in his or her thoughts, and in a fixed and coherent philosophical system. Since the 19th century, it has become impossible to apply these premises to modern drama. Next slide, please. An important formal aspect of the structural change in the genre of tragedy is the replacement of the tectonic or closed form by tectonic or open forms. Although this development occurred in this field of tragedy, it can also be understood as a paradigm for a more general affinity between strictly hierarchical social structure and formal unity or standardization in the field of aesthetic. The exploratory questions sketched out here do not amount to a complete repertoire for describing the programmatic elements of a dramatic text. Okay, next slide. Dramatic text and audience, collective perception and the transmission of information. The intended collective perception of dramatic text has considerable bearing on its internal structure.